Thank you for having me. So my goal today is just to give you a brief overview of special education disproportionality. I'm going to give you the high level, anticipating that when the second speakers come in, they're going to focus on Minnesota for you. So I just want to give you the broad kind of strokes of it. So like I said, brief overview of disproportionality. I'm going to discuss disproportionality as it addresses the populations we're of interest, interested in, and then how we can support change. A little background on me. So I originally started my training in psychology and sociology, which I think explains probably my interest in kind of macro policy issues and using large data. I went into school psychology wanting to support students' mental health in schools. But right as I was starting my program, I was reading a book called Why Are All the Minority Students in Special Education? And then I started my field training in what was a fairly diverse schools district in Arizona. And I was split between two schools. One that had a fairly typical special education population, about 15% of their students were identified, and they were about 50 to 60% white students. But literally my first day in the building, I was sent into special education classrooms to observe, and they were all black and brown students while I was reading this book. And then I went to the other building that I was assigned, which was, it was basically the equivalent of a magnet school like we had here. And quite literally, as I was picking up my badge, I listened to the principal coach out a student with special needs and encourage them to unenroll and go to this other school that I had just left. They were about a half a mile apart. And so that was my first week in graduate school. And so I ended up doing my master's looking at Arizona's disproportionality, and I'll explain what that is. But because I did that research, I ended up working in federal technical assistance centers for the rest of my time there. And there was a variety of different centers that we had housed. One was the National Center for Culturally Responsive Educational Systems, which was funded for about a decade to eliminate disproportionality in special education. That has not happened, as I will show you. But as a result of the intractability of the problem, there were additional centers funded, one funded to train principals to eliminate disproportionality, another funded to work with state departments to eliminate disproportionality. I ended my time there. We wrote a grant to have an equity assistance center, which is actually funded through the Office of Civil Rights. But the primary area of civil rights complaints in this country is actually related to disability. And so our team ended up doing that. But taken together, then, I became really interested in these educational disparities. I obviously shifted from being a mental health provider to being a researcher and trainer. I've also become really interested in professional learning and practice, like how do we prepare psychologists and educators to actually support these students? And again, I think because of that sociology background, really interested in systems and policy. But I am a psychologist by training. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I have been a certified school psychologist. And so much of my work centers around special education, which is the system that was codified in federal legislation in 1975. And how many of you are really familiar with special ed? Like you feel like you're well versed in it? I see Courtney or one special ed, so about half of you. So it's currently called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And special education is defined as a specially designed instruction at no cost to parents to meet the unique needs of a child with disability. And there are these core principles that are intended to guide the services that students receive. It should fundamentally be free, so again, no cost to the families, and appropriate, so tailored to the students, using an individualized plan, provided in the least restrictive environment. And this is really important because before this legislation was passed, literally millions of kids were excluded from school, and it could be for anything from perceptions of educability, and in the first iteration of the law, those were actually what some of the categories were called, like how educable were the children. There were also state laws that allowed kids to be barred from school just because teachers didn't want to look at them. And so you can go back into the history books and find state legislation that basically if a teacher didn't want to teach a student for whatever reason, they could be barred from school or placed in separate buildings, separate settings. The law increasingly emphasizes research-based practice and evidence-based practice, and throughout all of the different elements, protecting parent and family rights is really critical, and allowing due process anytime there's a disagreement, and nobody can be turned away. So that's a really important thing, especially when we get into talking about disparities around autism. So the system sounds great, but even before its inception, it's been recognized as kind of this double-edged sword in that it's been essential to grant access for students and to create this opportunity for these populations that were explicitly excluded from schools. But as we look at the data, and particularly the large data, we see that despite this access, which has been essential for so many kids and families, students generally have really poor outcomes. And to the extent that when we look at large scale, like population level studies, compared to similar kids who get nothing at all, on average, when we look at individuals with the more mild to moderate disabilities, they actually do poorer than they would if they get nothing. And that's true in early childhood and elementary school. We don't have necessarily the same research at the secondary level, but we do know that, say, the less intensive services students receive, for instance, particularly if they're primarily in general education as opposed to being placed in specialized settings, they actually do better, which is not what we would expect to see if students are getting these individualized plans that are appropriate to their level. For some disabilities, there's an expectation that students, when they're provided appropriate services and remediation, that their difficulties will be resolved and they can exit. But outside of individuals with speech language impairments, we rarely see that. So once kids are in, they're good. They're in indefinitely. And then despite the policy emphasis around least restrictive environment and including children in their community settings and general ed settings, we see a lot of exclusion in just the physical presence of students in schools. So it's not uncommon, and I know we have it here, where students with disabilities are literally placed in the basements, or they're in separate buildings. I come from Arizona, and what we would have there, because a lot of the schools were a series of open air individual buildings, the special education classrooms would be put like at the back of the playgrounds in portables, so in temporary structures. We also see a lot of the times these children not included in the curriculum, not included in school-wide programming. And so one of the areas I'm very interested in is prevention services and school-wide policy and practice that's intended to enhance the learning of all students. What we see, though, even though it's called school-wide practices, both students with disabilities and teachers and service providers of individuals with disabilities tend to be excluded entirely, which is especially ironic because the science and the theory that those systems are based on originated in special education. Yet the special education staff, families, and kids are oftentimes left out. Another issue that's been at the forefront since really kind of special education classrooms emerged following compulsory ed is that there's a lot of subjectivity in who has disabilities, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more. And then, as you are all probably aware, there's a certain amount of stigma associated with having a disability, and it varies across the disability categories. So when we talk about disproportionality at the most basic level, typically in the research and policy, we're talking about group differences. So these are racial differences, language differences, gender differences in any of these outcomes. Much of the research and policy focuses on identification, placement, and discipline. And we are increasingly seeing research that's now looking at differences in individual risk. So does being from a particular background change the likelihood of being identified with a disability, all other things being equal? We can also look at differences in who exits and who graduates. For certain disability categories, the dropout rates are 60, 70, 80%, depending on the context you're looking at. And so that becomes really important. How we calculate disproportionality varies. Typically, we're looking at indicators of risk, relative risk, and composition. Much of the research and much of the concern is around who's referred into the system and why, and then who is determined eligible. And this is driven by research that happened in the 70s and 80s, largely out of the University of Minnesota, that unfortunately showed that when schools are making these decisions, they don't attend to the data, that the decision is made at the point of referral as opposed to what an evaluation says. We also have research to show that people can structure evaluations to get to any outcome that they want. And so that becomes really important when we think about the subjectivity of identification. Usually if you're seeing reports or discussion of disproportionality at the most basic level, we start with what percentage or proportion of a group presents with some condition or outcome. So here, 29% of these circles are orange. When we want to actually say whether there's disproportionality, we're comparing two different groups. So here, if we compare group A to group B, group A is twice as likely to be orange as group B. If we flipped it and compared B to A, B would be half as likely. And so commonly what we see, and what I think you read in the report from our second presenters, was that in Minnesota, depending on the category you're looking at the group, you could have levels of like 4, 5, 6 times as likely to have certain outcomes in special education. In the literature, there's concern about both over-identification compared to some referent group and under-identification. In a lot of my work and the work that I use, we compare to white students as a stable referent and as kind of the majority or the dominant population. And then we look at how minoritized groups are treated in comparison. When we do that, then the primary consideration becomes when we see these differences, whether it's elevated or suppressed identification, is this a matter of differential susceptibility? Are some groups just more in need of certain services? And if they're identified more frequently, are they getting appropriate services? Or if we see certain groups aren't identified, is it because they simply don't have the needs? On the other side is this concern about whether we're just not identifying the right kids, and because of that, are they getting the wrong services? And that's really been what's dominated the conversation since the inception of special education. But this is an extremely controversial area. And I don't know if any of you, have you seen it on like CNN, MSNBC? Have you seen the news stories and panelists talking about whether special education is racist? It's been a conversation for the last probably 5 years. It's also something that comes up not infrequently on public radio stations, in editorials in the newspaper. And when we kind of drill down into what they're talking about, the disagreement is fundamentally about why do certain groups have different rates of disability. And for me, they can be situated into kind of these 3 classes of ideas. On the far side, and what we saw initially when special education was just being developed, before it was codified in the law, was this notion of it's about cultural difference, economic disadvantage, and differential ability. And when we actually look into the historical literature, a lot of the special education schools that then became the special education system that was codified in federal law started as a means to either segregate or assimilate immigrant populations, students of color in urban schools. And then those became the schools for students with emotional disabilities, students with learning problems, and things like that. So it wasn't actually about a medical condition, a health condition. It was about who's different in this population, who's new in the population, really, because we saw in certain cities, it would, depending on what the primary immigrant communities were, that's who was targeted for these special education schools. Those attitudes were eventually eclipsed, I would say during like the 80s to 90s, with these ideas of it's about interpersonal bias, cultural dissonance, that we have primarily white educational providers, and the school population looks increasingly different, and they don't know how to engage in schools or in providing education to these kids. And that was supported by some of the early literature that, as we looked at desegregation in particular, special education became a way to, yes, they're in the same school systems, but we can put them into those other buildings, those other classrooms, because the teachers weren't able to engage with them. The perspective I'm coming from, and that really we see the deficit perspectives and the systems perspectives are the ones that clash, are these ideas that the patterns we see are rooted in these deep systemic inequities. So even when we go back to these notions, we can go back to the arguments about cultural disadvantage. Even that we can trace back to these systematic difference in access, opportunities, and participation. And as I mentioned, when we look at kind of the history of special education and how these special schools came to be, it largely followed, again, compulsory ed. So now students are supposed to enroll. We really saw, in terms of the disproportionality conversation, following Brown versus Board of Education. So they could no longer segregate the students of color. So what we saw emerging were these conversations around disability being used to get students out of the settings. And so the early disproportionality conversations weren't just about students of color, they were about students who didn't speak English as a first language, students who were coming from immigrant families, students, again, who were living in urban contexts or whose families were working class. And the conversation eventually shifted to focus on race and white-black differences in particular. But a lot of us, when we're doing this work now, are framing disproportionality as being inseparable from this broader constellation of systemic inequities. Because, and if anything, it's more of a byproduct when we look at the disparities in special education as opposed to the core feature itself. One thing when we think about training professionals and just getting into the research to understand what's happening in schools, this basic question that we all kind of, or many of us circle, is, are we identifying the right students? And this is actually a surprisingly complicated question to answer, because first we have to think about what is disability. There are 13 categories included in federal law, but states can change those and modify them. So like when I was in Arizona, there were some categories that state chose to break into multiple categories based on level of need. There are other categories that some states eliminate some of the federal criteria or add their own criteria to it, which means place determines what is a disability. So literally you could go, 40 minutes east and be subject to different criteria for what counts. It's not like we think about like with the health system where like you don't, if you leave Minnesota with a particular condition, you still have that condition. Here, the way the system works, you have to be determined re-eligible if you leave. And because the states determine what a disability is, we see a lot of variability. Unsurprisingly then, the question of how do we reliably identify and do we reliably identify disability? In general, the answer is no. And we've done research here that suggests, the study that I have here that's linked in the slides you have, we were looking at whether there's racial bias in identification, and what we found is that there wasn't evidence of racial bias currently, but that's because that psychologists are so unreliable that we can't detect racial bias. And so we're seeing that, similar to what we saw in the research in the 70s and 80s, the data don't matter when people are making decisions about whether a student presents with a disability, even when we give them the criteria, which was deeply problematic. Another piece that becomes important when we talk about disproportionality is how we account for environmental determinants, particularly educational opportunity. Because for some of the disabilities encapsulated within the federal law, educational or economic disadvantage is explicitly identified as an exclusionary factor, which means if we know a student hasn't been in school, why would we expect them to be achieving at rates commensurate with their peers? But what that typically, or if we know a student has been in a school system with inadequate instruction, again, why would we expect them to have skills they weren't taught? Typically though, what that turns into is just looking at basic attendance rates, as opposed to, was the student provided appropriate educational opportunity to develop skills? So taken together, we don't know if we're identifying the right students. The consensus is largely that we're not. And when we think about what disability is, how we identify it, whether we're unbiased, at best we can say we're not sure. We can't actually say definitively for any of these questions any kind of, I think, positive answers. So we have a lot of disparities, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But the reason we have so much controversy is because people disagree fundamentally on whether disproportionality is problematic. There are people who say, we are identifying the right students and services are beneficial, so if special education gets you something more, if it gets you specially designed instruction, if it gets you individualized services, if it gets you more due process rights than you would have without it, why is that a bad thing? There are others, and I fall in this quadrant, because I think we're not sure if we're identifying the right kids. We have, I think, sufficient evidence to suggest that the identification we see isn't necessarily based on needs and isn't linked to appropriate intervention. And then again, if we look at a high level, we're not seeing beneficial outcomes. In terms of policy, we saw in 1997, it was introduced into federal legislation that states had to define for themselves what disproportionality meant. And in the law, that exclusively refers to over-identification, which becomes really important in the context of LEND, because under-identification, as far as the federal government is concerned, is not a matter of disproportionality. It is a matter of child find, which is the principle of going out and finding everybody who's eligible and then rejecting nobody. But states define it, and then they have to identify districts that meet that definition, and then the districts have to do something. And what that means has varied. One of the issues with state, or what do you think the issues are with states defining disproportionality for themselves? Yeah, so she said they can fudge the numbers and they might not necessarily base it on factual information. One of the things I had the pleasure of doing during my doctoral training in one of those technical assistance centers was actually reviewing states' plans on how they defined and identified disproportionality. And so what we would see is that some states develop their own special formulas for how to calculate disproportionality. And one state, for instance, when you actually reduce down the formula, it basically said for any district to be flagged, it was basically like 17.5 times more likely to be identified in a given category in order for that district to be identified. In Arizona, where we were housed, they took a slightly different tact, and what they did is they looked at their data and they said, of our 200 to 300 districts, we don't ever want to identify more than 6 districts as having disproportionality, so we'll change our threshold every year to just get no more than 6 districts. We had other states, though, Hawaii was one, I think Louisiana at one point, who said any difference warrants some kind of investigation. And so we kind of had that full spectrum of let's look at any kind of disparity and see if we need to take action, to let's formulate our system so that nobody can be identified. And I suspect in those states that were setting their criteria at like 17, 18, 20 times more likely to be identified, that was so that nobody could hit that threshold. In 2004, we saw a change in the legislation to include now that when disproportionality was identified, 15% of federal special education funds had to be reallocated to comprehensive early intervening services for students not identified for special education. So what this typically looks like is those handful of districts that happen to be identified in those states that actually were concerned about disparities. It meant during the summer, they're shuffling to figure out how do they typically change their staffing in order to move over that 15% to provide services to kids who weren't identified. And so it obviously became something that a lot of districts wanted to avoid, because it typically meant either eliminating or moving teachers out of providing services for these kids. It also required that districts had to review their policies, procedures, and practices to identify whether or not there were any of those contributed to the disparities identified. In the 3 years I reviewed state reports, nobody did. It was never about anything they did. And they could determine how they reviewed those. And rarely did states specify what had to happen. So unsurprisingly, there was literally no change in that time period, even though we had almost a decade of this policy. In 2016, the federal government, right before the Obama administration changed, like literally in December, they released these new regulations, generally titled Equity and Idea, which now required a standard approach, which means states couldn't make up their own formulas anymore, which is great. They still get to define their thresholds. They have to be reasonable thresholds, but they get to say why they're reasonable. They also have to identify the root causes. So it's not just look at your policies, procedures, and practices and then tell the State Department of Education that you're doing everything great. It's that you have to figure out what is causing the disparities and then act accordingly. Researchers don't know about the particular root causes, yet we're in a place now that districts have to figure that out, even though there's no agreement in the scholarly community about what those could be or how you would even figure out what they are. We're in this interesting state of limbo right now because the DeVos administration deferred the new rules 2 days after the compliance was supposed to go into effect in July. That deferral was stayed by a judge in 2019, a district court judge. The Department of Justice has appealed, and we're just staying tuned to see what happens. For now, states are required to engage in this, and so they're trying to cobble together plans. But it's unlikely that the monitoring that was specified and intended in 2016 is going to be what we see in 2020 and on. So as I mentioned, the main concern is around identification, and one thing that becomes really frustrating for a lot of communities and families is that, again, from a federal perspective, disproportionality only means over-identification. And when that happens, the expectation is that the districts will eliminate the disproportionality, so somehow reduce identification of the high-risk group. When there's under-identification, that is very explicitly not an issue of disproportionality from a federal perspective. But the expectation is that there will be some kind of efforts to increase the identification of the low-risk group. But again, if you happen to be in a school system that's identified, if you happen to be concerned about under-identification of certain communities or certain groups for particular disabilities, using the language of disproportionality with district administrators, with state administrators is complicated because the federal government has repeatedly emphasized that under-identification is not disproportionality. And it is not, you can't use those funds there, you can't redirect those efforts there. But as I mentioned, we've had now reform since 1997. We see almost no movement in the state patterns, with the exception of some disability categories like autism, for instance, that were new in the legislation relative to some of the others. And what we see when we look at state policy, as I mentioned, is intentional avoidance of any kind of sanction or change. And so we've had these requirements in place for quite some time. And both university-based researchers and even the Government Accountability Office did a study in 2013, which was part of the motivation for the equity and idea regulations that showed that states just can avoid doing anything if they want to, and there's nothing built into the policy that prevents it. So that's my general overview of disproportionality. Questions before we move into talking about what this means for students with NDD and IDD in particular. So when we think about disproportionality, we're largely talking about autism because that's one of the federally recognized categories. And so there, as I'll show in your next slides, there's 5 key issues that are driving this conversation, which is qualitatively different by and large than the historical conversation around disproportionality. Because what we see is a substantial gap in the prevalence of autism in special ed versus what we find from, say, CDC estimates or estimates in health settings. We see group differences in identification, but they're almost the reverse of what we've historically seen in other special education categories. We also see the complications of these multiple classification systems that are used, and a really deeply troubling lack of professional preparation to engage with students with autism and identify them. And then we're now seeing increasingly that people are recognizing that autism isn't a wholly objective identification, that it was considered comparable to, say, a visual impairment or hearing impairment where we could be identified by a health professional and everybody could agree that it's there, but we're seeing that that's not the case anymore. We can compare, say, the CDC estimates to the special education rates, and we're basically at a point now that we're about a decade behind in terms of the identification of students with autism. So the overall rate for students in schools is basically comparable to what we were seeing in 2008 in the CDC estimates. Certainly, like you said, we're seeing group differences in identification by gender, by age, by race. But one thing that complicates things a lot for families is that identification in one system doesn't necessarily relate or result in identification in schools. In schools, it's based on federal and state special education law. And so those don't map on particularly well. So if we go from one provider to the next or one sector of care from the next, eligibility criteria differ. Yet identification is required for services. And one particularly persistent and troubling issue in special education is that services should be individualized based on the student's particular strengths and needs. However, in a lot of schools, services are label-based. So depending on the category of eligibility, there are these unofficial expectations for who gets served where and how. Different labels also confer different amounts of funding. So a student with one disability versus another who might when we look at their actual performance and needs in the classroom might be comparable, but depending on the label applied by a team that determined eligibility, there can be differences 2, 3, 4 times more funding for one student than the other for the services that they're receiving. And again, I mentioned that eligibility in one system doesn't mean eligibility in another, even from one school system or one state to the next. And then for a lot of families who maybe are really struggling to get the medical diagnoses and they get those and then they go to schools. And I've literally had families come in with like a prescription for special education. That isn't how it works. That's not how it goes at all. In some places it's effectively meaningless. Yet school identification is really important. And when we look at the CDC surveillance sites, the sites with the highest reported rates of autism are actually the ones that include education records, because they can either do the education or health. But all of this is actually the patterns of special education versus health identification of autism is surprisingly, it's not what we would expect, given that the idea category of autism is actually much more broadly defined than what we see in, say, the DSM or other categories. Because most fundamentally, it just requires the communication and social interaction deficits versus the much more extensive criteria that are used in the health fields. Yet, the identification rates are much lower. This is in part because there are 13 categories included in IDEA. States can have more or less. But what we see is that students with autism can be identified in a range of categories. So the actual autism category is typically the largest, but we also see students with autism identified in the ones that I've underlined here. So emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, other health impairments, specific learning disability, and speech language impairment. We can also see students who are identified in multiple categories, and typically then the school team that includes evaluators, teachers, the family members, is supposed to determine which one is the primary thing that causes their difficulty. It's also no surprise that we see huge variability and under-identification because states' criteria for autism vary hugely. And so these columns, the meanings aren't necessarily essential, but there was a study in 2016 that basically coded for a dozen different features that could be included in the state requirements for identification. And this just gets you a sampling of how much they vary across states. Because in one state, there might literally be, so at Idaho, it's solely medical diagnosis, but then you could look to some of these other states in the table where they have 5, 6, 10 different things that have to be documented in order for students to be qualified. So it's not surprising at all then that states' ASD rates vary hugely. We see a low of basically 1% and a high of 18% and everything in between. And then when we look at, again, what their requirements are, they vary across the board. So it just makes things really complicated for trainers, for educators, and then for families and communities. When we look at the most recent estimates for differences in, say, CDC rates versus special ed rates, we still see substantial differences. For boys, they're bringing them fairly well aligned at the national level. But if we were to look at states or districts, it's all over the board. We still see pretty substantial differences for Girls are much less likely, almost half as likely to be identified in schools. When we look by the race ethnicity categories, again, it looks very different across those different groups compared to what we see in the CDC data. And the clinical diagnosis column is based on the CDC data. A few years ago, we looked at the variability across states. And so even though we have one picture when we look at the national data, when we look across states, it's just all over the board. So here, so like this was Hispanic students, Black students, this is American Indian students, and then this is probably Asian students. But again, if we look across all the 50 states in DC, the rates of disproportionality when we compare to white students, so this would be equivalent identification, it's all over the place. And then if we drill down within states, that we see similar levels of variability across districts. And so describing disproportionality is incredibly complicated. And it's one of the controversies that we see that gets a lot of attention in the popular media and social media. If you ever want to fall down a rabbit hole on Twitter, this is an interesting one. Because literally you can see like these day-long Twitter wars between researchers and lawyers and family advocates. I wouldn't encourage it, but it does give you, my research team, there's Dan Lawson is a lawyer, I think he's based in Colorado. He does work out here, especially related to discipline disparities, so he's partnered with some schools in the States. I really respect Dan. He will go for researchers who use shoddy methods, and he does not back down. And he's screenshotting data and tables and bringing all of his counter evidence, and he's delightful. But depending on what level we look at, the disparities can look very different. And so right now, one of the debates is whether or not disproportionality is even a thing, because there's research teams that are saying, we're actually not getting enough students of color in special ed at all, even though historically what we've seen is that for the most subjective categories where there's literally no agreement in the professional community on what they mean, we see that typically indigenous students, Black students, and in some situations, well, so those are primarily like grossly over-identified, which is what you saw in the Minnesota report that was shared with you. Then we see for Asian students who are not learning English, in many settings they have literally no chance of receiving any special education services. Now it could be that speaking a language other than English magically protects against any kind of disability. I suspect that's not the case, but it creates these deep divides within the scholarly community on what patterns matter, how we should look at it. One of the debates is whether, should we just look at national data that aggregates across all settings, or do we actually need to look at it across all the different dimensions? And that's what I would encourage. So why disproportionality policy matters for ASD is that states are expected to eliminate disparities, which is a tall order that can happen in a variety of ways. Sometimes what we see is that it occurs through suppressing identification of students with needs. There have been cases, particularly where it overlaps with civil rights complaints, where disproportionality can be created by transferring students to other school systems, especially alternative schools, in particular pushing students out of schools. We can see dropout rates go up, but special education rates go down. We can also see in the situations that we'd like to see is where prevention services, down to the level of like, we've seen districts and school systems and counties that do really well, where they start with maternal and child health services at the county level and working with the health departments and working with early intervention providers, and they can affect their special education rates. But this also becomes important in addition to state and districts maybe engaging in inappropriate practices to eliminate disparities, is this reallocation of funds, because the students who need services are still there. Federal funds are fairly low in terms of how much of state needs they cover. Typically it's right around like the mid-teens, but that's actually going down because funding is flat, yet identification has been increasing. But what we see especially is that there's a lot of settings where educators report being uncomfortable or afraid to identify students from racially minoritized backgrounds for fear that they're going to be flagged for disproportionality, especially now that the federal criteria have changed. But obviously, we're especially concerned about this because for students from racially minoritized backgrounds, schools are the primary provider of services for these students with autism. Depending on the sample we look at and the time, anywhere from 40 to 80% of students with autism are first or only identified with schools from racially minoritized backgrounds. So it is not the medical providers that are their first stop. It is actually the school-based providers. That means students are being typically identified later, so that we see among students of color, identification is happening 2 to 3 years later than white students because it's not happening by their health providers during early childhood. It's happening by school providers around kindergarten and first grade. So they're missing out on multiple years of intervention. We also see, unfortunately, that when we look at studies of the actual practices used in the identification of autism in schools, only about 25% of evaluators are using anything that could be considered best practice or research-based practice. There's a range across studies, but on average, it's around 25%, and it tends to be low. We can see this as an opportunity to enhance the school-based policies, procedures, and practices because these are malleable targets. We can focus on pre-service and in-service training. We can do outreach. We can also refine the policy to map on to what is essential practices and professional learning. But then it's probably not surprising when we think about the fact that a lot of students with autism, particularly students of color, are more likely to be identified, for instance, as having an emotional disorder, a behavior disorder. But if people don't know how to identify autism in schools, and they also don't know how to identify behavior disorders, when we combine that with the racial bias that we see in diagnosis, then we get this situation. Yes, absolutely. The providers themselves. So if we have like 100 providers, only 25% of them are actually using research-based practices when they're identifying it. Yeah. So the majority are using so the most common instruments used to identify autism in school have nothing to do with autism, social skills, or communication. And one thing we see from the literature on what data people use to make their decisions is that I honestly don't know how they select the data. So in our study, we actually formulated the cases such that certain decisions couldn't defensively be made because there weren't data to support the criteria, and that we provided counter evidence so that there just wasn't any way to like see what they saw. But then they would identify a particular condition, and then the data they reported that they used had nothing to do with the eligibility categories and the criteria. So, yeah, good question. Other questions? Yes.
Do you know what they were, like examples of what they were using if they weren't using the research-based?
Yeah, so a lot of it is IQ tests. And then I suspect there's some inference made about, say, differences in verbal versus other areas. Behavior rating scales are common, even when they're not normed for use with students with autism. So not autism-specific instruments, but omnibus rating scales. Well, these studies, they were either, a lot of them, some of them were records reviews, but they were also surveys of like, do you identify students? What do you use? We can look at the records, as you're saying. Yeah, the research is not terribly promising, though. And we don't see great improvements in the more recent studies versus the older studies. Other questions? Yeah. So I think the very notion of like standard batteries or standard protocols, like this is what we use. These are the tests we give, everybody gets them, is inconsistent with special education law. So you can go back and quote that. For students of color in particularly, a lot of the instruments are not normed well or not developed well. There's some great research by Aaron Barton and Bryn Harris that's actually looking at the cultural appropriateness of the different measures, and so they've been publishing quite a few studies on for students who are coming from racial minoritized backgrounds, for students who are not first language English, what should we be doing? Like, what are the defensible instruments to use? And so I think their research is really helpful. Yeah. Other questions? So in terms of next steps, given that the current research base and policy landscape isn't particularly encouraging, I think when we think about this population in particular, there are a variety of different steps we can take, starting with community outreach, making sure that we're actually fulfilling the spirit of Child Find and Zero Reject, making individuals aware of their rights and opportunities. That's a lot of what we emphasize in those tools I think Rebecca shared from the Great Lakes Equity Assistance Center that we develop products for. It's really how do we protect civil rights? Because for me, these disability issues are inextricably linked there. How do we make the information accessible? And one thing that we see still, and if we look historically, is that special education is this weird quagmire, and we still have a lot of cases where the actual nature of the services, the implications thereof, are not framed well. But really, this goes back to empowering families to make the best decisions for their children and working with families authentically. Much of the impetus and the traction that was the basis for the federal policy came from family and community grassroots efforts. But a lot of that has been, it still happens certainly, and we've seen, for instance, great progress here and in other states around other disability areas. But in the bureaucracy, perhaps, and in all of the different policy requirements, the family role and those family rights can be ignored or suppressed. And so I think making sure families understand their rights and making sure educators understand and respect the rights of families and communities becomes essential. We also have to get away from the low rates of research-based practice, both in identification and in services. So it's really about professional capacity building, again, pre-service and then in service as well. Another key piece of the special ed policy that we didn't talk about a lot, but is this notion of collaborative teaming, in multidisciplinary teaming. It's perfectly allowable and I think should be encouraged to bring everybody to the table who knows the student well and who can support reasonable decisions. So if families want their service providers from health and community settings to be providing input, to be literally at the table for these decisions, that's within their right. We don't see it nearly as much as we should, but when we look at, say, we've done research looking at, say, multi-sector involvement, so looking across health, mental health, juvenile justice, behavior, all the different areas in schools. The highest rates of multi-sector involvement are students with autism, students with emotional disturbance, but we don't see good engagement of these external providers in the school process. But if we think about kind of maximizing student outcomes, that's what we need to see. We also have to see culturally responsive and adapted practices. So again, I think on the identification side, I really like Aaron Barton and Brent Harris's work, but we've got a lot of other work there on how do we actually make this appropriate for students from diverse communities. And in keeping with that, actually doing individualized planning so that just like we shouldn't have a standard battery to figure out what disability a student has, we shouldn't have a standard package of services because every child is unique. And then it has to be monitored and there has to be legitimate investment in continuous improvement as opposed to just technical compliance in reducing disparities. Ultimately, this is all about getting us back to that basic question of, are we identifying the right students? Ideally, we are, that we're getting students the services they need, and those services are beneficial. And then again, we're keeping things free, individualized, least restrictive, research-based. I can't emphasize enough the importance of involving families in the process, following due process, and not turning anyone away. So that is what I have for you today. Any other questions? So it's going to be a multidisciplinary team. So it's not like a principal or a teacher makes the decision. It has to be a team that includes the family. Ideally, that means there's some initial conversations, agreement about what an evaluation should include. Then there's consideration of the data relative to criteria, and then together the team makes the decision. That's what it could be. What too often we see is that Parents are asked to sign off and told what will happen. Some data are solicited from them via questionnaires, maybe a meeting with like a school nurse or a social worker. And then the team makes a decision about whether they meet eligibility, and then parents are basically asked to sign off on things. The way the law is specified, parents are supposed to be full participants in the process. But your state law is going to identify who has to be at the table. And it can vary depending on the disability that's being considered. But the laws are generally specified where if we're going to be in compliance with the law, breadth and comprehensiveness, both in terms of the process and the participants, is what's expected. And certainly, families can request that. I also think it's great to enlist advocates who might understand the systems a little better to help that process, but it's supposed to be a team decision in which the family is part of the team. And parents have to sign off on things. Like students can't get special education services without parent consent. So, well, thank you for sharing your experience. So the team process is an expectation for special ed. I actually went through that process with my daughter this year and had a similar kind of the curiosity around how it proceeded. And they didn't know I don't think they looked at my forms. So they didn't know like what I do, and they did. At the very end, she actually asked it to my daughter's dad, and she assumed that he was he's like, oh, there's a professor, it must be that guy. So that was delightful. And then, well, no, it's me, what do you do? And then she was very concerned about my interpretation of her behavior. So we're not in the Wayzata district, but we had pretty much the same experience where it's just come in and like sit down right away and jump into the testing. That isn't best practice. And there's a literature that suggests that, especially with these unfamiliar evaluators, students don't do well. They're going to do better with a familiar person. They're going to do better with a person from a similar background. There was an article, I think in the Star Tribune this year on the whole kindergarten process and the testing in early. I would suspect we would see that the people who make it through the process have certain characteristics. And that the notion of encouraging them to go to different schools is not uncommon, unfortunately. But for kindergarten screening, it's a unilateral decision by the school. It's not a team decision. So, unfortunately. Any last question if we have time? At the most basic level, I think the special education system is a mess. And so why do we see wildly different identification rates between health and education? When we go back again, like to what is disability, how do we identify it? How does this intersect when we think about biases and differential opportunity and enactment of the process as intended? We see a lot of instances where it's not going well. When we combine that with the lack of professional preparation to engage with individuals with autism and the relative ambiguity of what any disability category means, it's not terribly surprising that a large number of students who have health diagnoses of autism are identified in other categories. Like if you have no training and nobody on the team has training, and if the decision that the child has a learning disability is made before the testing even happens and that decision doesn't change, that's not to say it's not going well and operating as it should some places, but in many cases it's building specific and it's about who's in the building and the capacity they bring. Some systems have really good, or some school systems have good infrastructure for it, but like I've worked with school districts that have maybe teams of 30, 40 psychologists, one person per building, or people sharing buildings, but like one person in the whole district who has any training in autism. And so they're this roving psychologist who's supposed to be serving the entire community. And what that turns into is you have these itinerant evaluators with I've driven like a trunk full of tests, and you go into whatever room you can get for 2 hours, do what you can as quickly as possible, and then you drive to the next. And so is it any surprise that things get missed? Um, yeah. I think it's a confluence of a lot of things.
And is that like,
Well, so when I was in Arizona, there was a separate pot of money that provided a very large amount of money for tuition for private placements, just for students with autism. So we would have individuals with any range of health diagnoses requesting the autism diagnosis so that they could access that extra pot of money, because it was something like $40,000 a year to send your student somewhere else. And so we would have students with severe mental health conditions, certainly, who needed high levels of services and would certainly benefit from specialized placement, but it wasn't autism. But because labels can drive funding, which can drive the decisions that schools are making about who gets what services, we can see pretty high levels. And we had a clinic that the joke was, well, it wasn't a joke. I mean, they didn't have to meet students to give the diagnosis. It was basically a drive-through. And so we would see really high rates of autism in those communities. But it's because parents wanted the best thing for their kid, and if you knew the school, if they gave one label, they would get $1,600 a year, and if they give this other label, you get the base rate, plus you can access this extra huge pot of money. Yeah. But I think it's hard to make sweeping categorizations because there's so many differences across states, across school systems, and again, across buildings. But I think we need to transition. We'll have time at the end for more questions. We have 45 minutes then. But thank you.